Hello. Before watching the video, I'd appreciate if you went and followed my Twitch channel at twitch.tv/stevis5. The link is in the comments, so make sure to just go and give me a follow. Also, I'd appreciate if you subscribe to my YouTube channel. Enjoy! Hello everyone, and welcome to today's video. In this video, I'm going to be talking about how to beat a Grandmaster in chess. Now, I've only beaten a handful of Grandmasters in my chess career, but last week I got the chance to play Grandmaster Alexander Raitsky, an older Russian Grandmaster who's written several chess books, someone who may not be the most well-known, but certainly is a very strong player, and I got a chance to play him in a 4-game blitz match. So without further ado, let's jump into the first game. In this game, I was white, and I started with 1d4. My opponent responded with d5, and I played bishop f4, the London system. My opponent played c5, trying to strike at the center. Now, for those of you watching who are maybe newer to chess, you might think, oh, well, that's a free pawn. And generally, you don't want to take on c5 when black offers this pawn like this for multiple reasons. For one, black can give a check right away, attacking the king and the pawn, and that wins the pawn back by force. But black can also even just start developing their pieces, and now that my pawn isn't on d4 anymore, black can try to gain control over the e5 square. And if they get the chance to play e5, they also open up their bishop to attack and likely win the c5 pawn. Okay, so I played e3, and this is kind of the classic London setup, where you have this pawn chain, and the bishop is outside the pawn chain. So my opponent plays knight c6, I played c3, just solidifying my center, and we get an extended pawn chain, the pawn chain now on both sides. This is often called the triangle setup. You may have heard a different name for it. And my opponent here plays f6. Now, this is an interesting move, and generally, people may tell you not to push your f-pawn because it's weakening to your king. And here I would be doing very well if my bishop were already on d3, because then I would be able to play queen h5 check, and my opponent cannot play g6 because I can take. However, that's not the case, and here if I go for queen h5, my opponent can just play g6 and block the check. So, essentially my opponent's idea here is to play e5 and take control of the center. So I played knight f3 to stop that. My opponent plays h5. Now this is a very tricky move, because if I play a natural developing move like bishop d3, for example, my opponent can play g5, and now my bishop is trapped. The only square that my bishop can go to is g3, but then my opponent can push h4, and this pawn chain really nicely blocks out the bishop. It can't go to f4, it can't go to e5, it can't go to d6, it can't go to c7, and it can't go to b8. With that in mind, in this position I played the move h3 to give my bishop the escape square on h2. My opponent played g5, I moved the bishop back. So here I could have played bishop h2 as well. Bishop g3 was kind of trying to bait my opponent into playing h4 in some way so that I could then go back with the bishop, and now my opponent's not as flexible because they can't play the move g4. Also, on g4, I can take, and they can't take back with the pawn because of this pin. So just some small nuances that led me to decide to make the move bishop g3 here. My opponent played c4. And c4 is trying to lock out my bishop, basically. My bishop wants to go to the d3 square and take control of the light squares, but now the bishop can't do that. That being said, c4 is to some extent a weakening move because my opponent's overextending and this pawn isn't easily supported. And I play the move b3 here, which is a very nice move because it just chips away at his center. And if he plays b5, I can play a4 to now put pressure on the b5 pawn and the c4 pawn. And now if my opponent plays a6 to defend the b5 pawn, I can just take. Because this isn't actually defending the b5 pawn, because this pawn is pinned. And if my opponent takes back, I can just grab the rook on a8. So this is a common idea to just put pressure on the pawn on c4. So in this position, my opponent took on b3, I took back with the pawn, and now I'm very happy with my position out of the opening because I have the opportunity to always push c4 and put more pressure on the center. So my opponent played knight h6, I played bishop d3, just developing. This also has the idea of possibly going bishop g6 check at some point. My opponent played bishop f5, I played queen c2, just attacking my opponent's bishop. My opponent played queen d7, defending. I just continued development with knight bd2. And now my opponent plays bishop g7, developing their bishop. This is kind of an ugly square for the bishop. And here, if I were black, I might consider playing e6 to try to develop the bishop to either e7 or d6, where it feels like the bishop is a little more active. But my opponent played bishop g7 in the game, and I played e4, just striking in the center. Keep in mind that my opponent still hasn't castled, and it feels very awkward for them to castle kingside, given that they pushed all these pawns on the king side. So I want to open up the position so that I can attack my opponent's king. So after some trades, my opponent plays the move b6. Honestly, kind of a strange move, and I'm not really sure exactly what my opponent's aim was in playing the move b6. So I just castled. My opponent played rook c8, trying to get the move knight b4. Knight b4 takes advantage of the pin of the queen on c2. And if my opponent gets in knight b4, then all of a sudden they're back in the game. Because I have to move my queen, and then my opponent gets to trade knight for bishop, and I'm stuck in this ugly pin. So let's say I play some random move. My opponent goes knight b4, I move the queen, take, and now you can see that I'm in this pin. And my opponent can eventually play moves like queen d5 to gang up. In the game, I played queen e2, just sidestepping that idea. Now, my opponent played h4, and here, I played the move knight d6 check. And now, this takes advantage of another pin in the position that my opponent cannot take with the pawn because the queen pins the pawn to the king. They also don't want to take with the queen because my bishop defends. And because this is a check, they don't have time to take my bishop. So, my opponent played king f8 in the game, and here I had to make a decision. So, I can actually take the rook on c8. And that was my first instinct. But then I realized, well, actually, if my opponent takes the bishop, my knight's just trapped. And so I'm temporarily up the exchange. I have a rook for a bishop, but my knight just can't go anywhere. So I have to give it up for a pawn somehow. And then I'm just gonna be down material. opponent will have 2 pieces for the rook. And 2 pieces are 6 points, the rook is 5. So generally that's a slight advantage. I instead took the bishop. With that in mind, my opponent took back, and I just moved my bishop out of danger. And here my opponent played e6, trying to consolidate. I played rook fe1, just hitting the pawn. My opponent plays rook e8. I play bishop b5 here, just putting more pressure. And one thing to be noted here is that this is a long-term pin, because my opponent can move their queen out of the way, but this knight is still pinned to the rook. So it's going to take them several moves to unravel their pieces here. And my opponent plays rook e7, aiming to move the queen next to b7 most likely, because c7 would blunder the queen. So I played queen c4, now attacking the knight, and they can't play queen b7 because I just take. And here they played knight d6. And this is a tricky move, because at first I thought, well, okay, I just take their knight, and I'm up a piece. But this would have let my opponent off the hook, because there they can take my bishop. I can't take their knight, because their queen defends, and if I trade queens, I'm not attacking the knight anymore, and it's just even material. So, instead, I took a minute to think, and I played bishop takes d6, and in this position my opponent actually resigned, because if they take back, now I can just take the knight, and I'm up a piece, completely winning.